Good morning, students. I owe you guys a bit of an apology. I was trying to make this lesson a little easier to comprehend and work through than it was for our students last fall, because last fall, as you understand, we were actually in class and we had lectures that were face-to-face, which makes it a little bit easier to cover some of the more complex ideas because that gives me a chance to really see if people are catching on or where people are getting stuck. So I tried to simplify the lesson a little bit for this semester. An unfortunate side effect of that simplification is the lesson, as I delivered it to you, there's one aspect of it that simply does not work. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about why it doesn't work and what you need to do to make it work, and I'll also kind of help you understand how I missed that. So the part I'm really talking about is this bind property decorator, which is a really, really useful thing that was introduced in ASP.NET. So I do want you guys to be aware of this. Now, if you read in, you'll notice that at one point I talked a little bit about how there were different ways of tackling, bringing in, and binding properties. And let's go ahead and talk about a couple of those. So the first one that we talked about was using the query object. So say we wanted to get the search terms out of the request, we would look at request.query, and this is a dictionary. It basically takes the values in our filters. So for example, this search terms, whatever value gets entered in here, will get parsed into that dictionary and stored under this key. So we could actually just put in search terms. Now we want this to be persisted, so we'd also want to assign it to our corresponding property, which we could do by changing this from just the variable to search terms, and that's going to save it. So now that will persist it, that will then put it into this query. We're going to have it around long term. That works pretty well for most of this, but we get into the thing of what about these doubles that are our IMDb ratings and our Rotten Tomatoes ratings. And we said those need to be nullables because there is a possibility somebody hasn't filled out those filters, and we don't want to have a default value. And you might be wondering, what's the big deal about having a default value there? Why can't we just set the minimum to be a default of 0 and the maximum to be a default of 100, which are the smallest and largest values that those IMDb ratings can be? And the reason we don't want to do that is if we go look at our code, our actual data coming in from our database, you'll notice that not all of these movies have an IMDb rating. And of course, there aren't any good examples right away, but let's dig a little bit deeper. IMDb rating. There we go. So for example, here's a movie, Batman the movie, which has no IMDb rating and no IMDb votes and no Rotten Tomatoes rating. So without those ratings, if we were to go ahead and use a maximum and minimum default filter, that means that we would always be filtering. So if we look at our filter for IMDb rating, that means we would always be executing this very last filter step, which looks at all the movies. And if the movie rating, IMDb rating, is null, notice this is false, and it's automatically removed from the list of results. So if we did specify a maximum and minimum filter, any movie that did not have a Rotten Tomatoes rating would not be included in our results, so it just wouldn't show up on the page. And that's not really the behavior we want. So we can't do the minimum and maximum. We have to deal with the possibility that these are null, which indicates that we're not actually going to use that particular filter. So that brings us down to, okay, we do have to make these null. So how would we deal with that in terms of pulling it out of the query object? Well, we could say, for example, tomatoes min equals request.query and tomatoes min. However, what we're going to pull out of this dictionary is going to be a string. So even though we know it's supposed to be a double, this is not going to pull out a double, it's going to pull out the string that was entered as that value. And you can see here it says I cannot convert a string value to a double. I don't know how to do that. So we would have to do that conversion ourselves. And the way that we would normally do that is we would do double.parse. And as long as this string actually is a double as a string, so it's a number possibly with a decimal place in it, it's going to parse that and put it in as a number. Now if that parse is not possible, say this is a string that says foo, this double.parse is actually going to return not a number, or NaN. The same thing if this string is an empty string, we're going to get NaN as a value. So we will effectively have set this to not a number. There we go. So that particular special value that indicates that this is not a number. Now that is a valid value for a double, which means when we hit our filter here, we're going to have that specified as nan. So we're going to go ahead and try to filter against that. But nan and comparisons don't really work because number is not something we can compare. So we can't just do that. We have to do this double.parse, but then we're going to have to check to see if that's not a number. Or actually we could also do the is not a number test on it. That's probably a little bit more, yeah, either one of those should work. But we can check, is this yeah. So did I misspell something? Oh, because that is a double nullable. Yeah, so let's just do a var value, throw this value in here. So if that's not a number, we're going to set it to null. Otherwise, we'll set it to the actual value. And you can see here, this is a lot of steps just to do a conversion. Now, it's a necessary process, but you can see this is probably not something that, if we can avoid writing all of that, we probably will want to avoid writing all that. So one of the other ways I showed you is we can actually put the arguments into this initializer, so that would be on get method. So we could do a string for the search terms, and we could do a double for the tomatoes min, but because these only exist inside the body of this method, we would have to actually set the ones that are existing outside of that body as well. So here we would set this equal to the search terms, and notice that because we're using the same name, search terms here and search terms here, C# needs to know which is which. It's going to use this one by default, and here it's complaining that you're setting a variable back to itself, because technically it's looking at the same one. But if we put this period in front of it, we're saying that this search terms is the class variable, so this instance variable up here. So we're setting that variable equal to this argument. And we can do the same thing for the tomatoes min. Okay, and you notice this is a lot cleaner. We're pulling in this tomatoes min from there. And the benefit of putting it in the argument like this is now ASP.NET is handling that casting operation for us. So if what's coming in is an empty value or something that can't be cast to a double, instead of turning it into not a number, it's going to turn it into null. So it's basically doing exactly the code we just typed. It's just that we don't have to type that code anymore. That processing is being done for us. So this is a good way of doing it. And then the other way I tried to show you is the decorator, which is property. Oops, that's the movies. We don't want to put one on that. So here in our search terms, the bind property decorator. And we could put that on top of each and every one of these guys. And what that does is that indicates to .NET that we want all of those properties to be bound, which means we don't have to put them here and we don't have to do this step. So all we would have to do is the filter. And that's where the lesson that I gave you guys was pointing and taking you towards. Now there's a bit of a problem with that, and I didn't realize that at the time because we handled this a little bit differently last time. And that's if we go in and look at the model binding in ASP.NET in the documentation, and we dig through it and just read a little bit of this documentation. Yeah, somewhere in that article, right there, model binding for HTTP GET request. So that is just, it's in here somewhere. There it is. So looks like it's about a quarter of the way down. By default, properties are not bound for HTTP GET requests. So what does that mean? That means that what we're doing in our code here is getting a GET request. These are not being bound by default. And so to really understand this, we need to take a step back and talk a little bit more about HTTP request methods. So there are a number of methods that are defined in HTTP. The two that you're going to work with the most often are GET and POST. And what these are is they're ways of identifying what the request that the server is receiving is asking it to do. And they're attached or have some semantic meaning. So a GET request means you're requesting a document or a resource from that server. That's traditionally what it would mean. So every time you type something in the address bar and hit the enter key, that is making a GET request from the server. Every time you click on an anchor tag, that is making a request from a server. A POST request is for putting something new onto the server. So you're uploading a document or you're submitting a form is usually what the POST request is for. So uploading a file, things like that. The put and the patch are changing something that's already on the server. So saying, I want to take this entry, maybe my Facebook profile, and I want to update it with some new data. The delete is to remove something from the server. The connect is to create a tunnel between your client, the browser, and the server for something like WebSockets or things like that. Trace and head, just get some debug information. There's different uses for these. But the two that you're going to deal with the most, like I said, are GET and POST, because those are the two that browsers support. The rest of these are really more things that if you were writing software to talk to the web, so not really a web page, but actually a program that would communicate with the web, so maybe a desktop app that communicates with your Facebook, or some kind of application for a phone that talks to a backend server, then you might get into some of these others. But for the actual World Wide Web, most of what we're going to do is going to center around these two requests. Now, forms are handled differently based on if they're submitted through a GET request or a POST request. If it's a GET request, then it's going to use URL encoding, and it's going to append the data in the form up here in the URL using the query strings, that question mark, and then key value pairs, which are separated by ampersands, or sorry, and symbols. And we've seen that. If we submit it with a post request, instead of appending that here, it actually gets concatenated into the body of the request. So the request body becomes that form. That is serialized again there, but it uses form encoding. So it's a slightly different encoding. It actually looks very, very similar, but it is slightly different. Okay. So we can actually submit a form either way. And there's a question there is, okay, if that's the case, which is the right way to submit my form? And that's really one of those soft questions where the answer is it really just depends. And there's not necessarily a right or wrong way in any case. However, if you think about what the underlying meanings, semantic meanings that are supposed to be attached to these are, that can give you some guidance. So if what you're appending in your form is something that is modifying what you're asking for, like maybe it's specifying, I want this file, but I want this file in this particular format. So you request a movie and you say, I need this in an MP4 format. Or if it's modifying, say, adding a filter on a search request or something like that, it's very common that those would be done with a GET request because they're semantically changing what you're asking for. Whereas a post request is usually for if you're actually putting something up on the server. So you're adding something to the server or changing something that's on the server, because that has that more semantic meaning. You might be wondering, why are there the two and why can you use them both that way? A lot of it's just historical. There are a couple big differences, like a file you cannot put into a GET request. It just doesn't work. You can only submit files with a post request, and when you submit a file and form, it actually uses a completely different serialization format called multi-part encoding that allows it to embed binary data for the file plus the serialized form data. If you take the CIS 526 course, we'll get into the nitty-gritty details of all of that. But those are kind of the different ways of doing that. Let's see. So that really it just kind of depends on how you want to use it, and you can actually use them interchangeably. So there's not, for the most part, a strong reason to go one way or another. The other thing I will say is because the GET request does append those query values up here as a query string, if what you're uploading or sending has a lot of data, which means it will be serialized as a lot of characters, you probably would prefer to put it in a post because this URL you don't want to get too large. In fact, while it's not required by there's guidance from the W3C that your GET request or your URL really shouldn't be over a certain length because not every browser and not every web server is going to accept an inordinately long string as your URL. So just for caution's sake, you probably don't want to put a really, really big serialized chunk of data into this GET request. So if you have a really big form, use a post. So how do we actually do that here? Well, if we wanted to use a post request, we come back and look at our form, and we're going to change the method that our form is using. And we can set that to post. So now this will be submitted with a post request. And that's going to cause a couple of problems for us, and we'll talk through those. So the first is well, let's go ahead and just run it, and then we'll talk through the problems and how to fix them. So if we go ahead and do a search and click that post, notice that we suddenly crash. We get this null reference exception, object reference not set to an instance of objects. And here it's complaining that this line is the problem. Of course, what we're accessing is that model.movies. So if we come back over to our code, we are setting the movies here in our getter, our onGet method. Now, in a post request, it would trigger the onPost method. And notice that because we didn't have one, it technically doesn't have a body, so there's no initialization of this movie database at all. So we would have to go ahead and set up the value for that list here as well. And we could go ahead and do our search here. So we'll go ahead and just put in our search with our search terms, which should be bound because we specified it should be bound. And then we can go ahead and do all of our filters as well. And for these guys, we need to be passing in the movie list as well as the filter values. Okay, so if you remember, the search method, as we currently have it written, is going to look through the entire database and find the ones that match the search terms. Then we're going to filter that list by our MPA ratings. And we're going to filter that list by our IMDb rating. We're going to filter that list by our Rotten Tomatoes rating. And we also want to do the genres in here as well. And our list is called the genres. There we go. So now if we run it, we shouldn't see that null request because when we do our get, we're going to use the entire list. When we do our post, we're going to use our filters. So right now, this has been gotten with a get request. If I click the search button, we're submitting that form. That makes this a post request. And notice that we don't see the query string up here anymore. But we are seeing the results of that, and we've persisted our filters and all of those different values. And we can go ahead and do maybe a little bit more advanced of a search. Looks like maybe I have a logic problem with my IMDb rating. Nope, well, those went through, but we're not actually persisting. I probably just have an error in my syntax because I did that awful quickly. IMDb max, yep, I didn't actually put the value in. And notice I'm still running the server, so I can go ahead and resubmit this. So the web stuff is really interesting because if what you're changing is a Razor page, or the CSS files, or the JavaScript files, so any of the static files, or any of the files that are going to be rendered as a page, you don't actually have to restart the server in order to get those changes in. Now if we mess with any of the data files or the files that are actually controlling like our page models, those we will have to recompile because those are actually being compiled to a DLL that's being used by the server. Notice now that's persisting, we're getting our filtering, everything's working the way we want. And that was because we switched to using a post request instead of a get request, which allows these bind properties to work correctly. We can actually use the bind property in a get request as well. We just have to say supports get and set that to true. So we have to add a little modifier there to say this should also bind in a GET request. So that was what was missing from the lab discussion. So now we've seen that we can do it with GET request, we can do it with POST request. So hopefully that clears up any questions that you might have on this assignment moving forward. Now, because I did submit this with some errors, and I know that led to some frustration, this has been a little bit more challenging than our usual assignment, I'm going to go ahead and push back the deadline on this assignment and on the milestone by a couple of days, just to give you a chance to work through those. And I'll be editing the tutorial to reflect this change as well. So that all will be coming out shortly. Just go ahead and finish that up, and you can go ahead and submit it if you have it working, but this is probably something you might have run into and been struggling with. So hopefully that helps, and we will talk to you guys later.